Okay, let's talk about fuel pumps. So exactly how does a fuel pump in a sled work? How do you take it apart? What's it look like inside? And what are some of the signs and symptoms that you might see when your fuel pump starts to fail? I started seeing a few issues last year that were telling me there might be a problem with the fuel pump. So this year I saw something else and I just decided to go ahead and replace that fuel pump. That gives me the opportunity to pull the old one apart. Of course, that means you get a video. All right, so as I mentioned, I already replaced the fuel pump in my 97 MXZ 670. Now, you want to stick around to the end of the video because I replaced that fuel pump even though I wasn't 100% sure the problem was with the fuel pump itself. And as a matter of fact, it turned out that there were problems in virtually every part of the fuel system for this sled. So I did that for a couple of reasons. So I put a relatively inexpensive aftermarket fuel pump in the sled. Now I can take my time, disassemble the old one and clean it and repair it if I need to. If not, I can put it back together and either put it on the shelf for a spare or put it back on the sled and keep the new one as a spare. So I bought an AHL pump that I found on Amazon. So it is an aftermarket product. It's probably not going to last as long as the OEM. The other option that we have is if we need to rebuild this pump, you can buy rebuild kits for under 20 bucks. One of the things that I will point out, if you've got one of these fuel pumps made for Bombardier in Taiwan specifically for these 90s era skidoos, you will read or hear that they're not user serviceable. So you're not supposed to disassemble them because the diaphragm in them is factory tensioned. Having said that, I've talked to lots of guys that have rebuilt these pumps and had no trouble. You know, maybe it's not going to be as efficient as this pump was brand new out of the factory. My personal feeling is it's probably going to be more efficient than this specific pump is after all those years of wear and tear. So just to be clear, for today's video, we're talking about these pulse or vacuum style fuel pumps. There are different styles in other sleds. So this 600 it's a fuel injected sled. So it actually has two pumps, a high and a low pressure. It has an electric fuel pump in the gas tank. But again, we're talking about the pulse style that's in a lot of sleds. So removing and reinstalling the fuel pump is really simple. You don't have to prime it or bleed it. So where is it? It's going to be in a really low part of the sled. On this one, it's right below the carburetors. So the location on your sled might be different. I know some of the Polaris sleds have them on the airbox. Basically, just follow the fuel lines back from your carburetors and you'll find it. So you're going to want to begin by getting the carburetors out of the way. In my case, I cleaned them, so I completely disconnected them, but you can get away with just disconnecting the fuel lines and leaving the throttle cables attached. So to start off, you want to shut the fuel off, and then if you've got something like that, you can clamp your fuel line off as well. So once the carbs are out of the way, I unbolted the fuel pump first. Just made it easier to work with. I removed the pulse line and then I swapped the fuel line from the old pump to the new pump. The fuel lines out to the carbs were already disconnected from the carbs. Okay, so how does this thing work? You know, there's some older technology that you look at and it's so simple, it's genius. And that's the case with this. There's almost no moving mechanical parts inside of this. I would have thought that there would have been an impeller or gears or a piston. The only thing inside of this is a flexible diaphragm and a couple of valves. So let's start, we'll just look at the outside of the fuel pump. So on one side, you've got this big inlet. We know it's an inlet because there's an arrow there to show it. And then on the other side, on the same level, you've got these two outlets. So that's because my sled has two cylinders. And then this port here is where the pulse line connects, and we'll talk about that one in a bit. So some of these fuel pumps are going to look different. Some of them would be smaller and rectangular, some of them will be round, but they all kind of do the same thing. So let's go ahead and open this up. Okay, so there's that flexible diaphragm. So on one side of that diaphragm, it should just be an air space. So you can see we've got some dirt in there. There's no holes or tears in it. There is a little bit of deformation. So it's a bit like a bubble instead of being flat. So that's about what you would expect to see after years of use. Okay, now on this side of the diaphragm should just be fuel in this space. And then you'll notice that we have another diaphragm on this side. So when you lift up on that diaphragm, it's going to pull fuel into the inlet through these one-way valves. Then when you push down on the diaphragm, it's going to push that fuel through these one-way valves and out to our carburetors. So because this is a high volume pump, it actually has a second diaphragm. Not all fuel pumps have this. So basically having a flexible diaphragm under each chamber just helps the fuel to move more efficiently through these one-way valves. So what moves this diaphragm? That's the cool part. So when your piston moves up in the cylinder, it creates an area of negative pressure under the piston in the crankcase. And then when it moves down in the cylinder, it creates an area of positive pressure in the crankcase. So that pressure vacuum differential is transmitted to the diaphragm in the fuel pump via the pulse line. So back here, just to the right of my carburetors, there's a rubber hose coming out of the crankcase. That's the pulse line. So obviously, if your pulse line is blocked or cracked or even kinked, that's going to affect how efficiently the fuel pump works. Little tiny hole or vent in the top of the pump, that just lets this airspace equalize with the atmosphere and prevent a buildup of vacuum or pressure. So now that we understand how these things work, it's easier to understand how they can fail. And to be honest, they don't fail that often. So let's start out by talking about some of the symptoms that I was seeing that made me suspect my fuel pump in the first place. The first thing I noticed was last season, I didn't have this Sled out much, but what I did notice was poor response at wide open throttle. So when I pinned it, it was bogging down. So if your engine is sucking fuel out of the bowl faster than a weak or defective fuel pump can fill it, you're going to be fuel starved. Now there are several things that'll cause that, right? You could have a plugged main jet, you could have a clogged fuel filter, you could even have a sticky rave valve. So at that point, I wasn't going straight to fuel pump. I was thinking I'm going to clean the carburetors. I didn't actually get to that last year. I put the Sled away, but this year I pulled the carbs off to clean them. So it was fairly wet with fuel and oil down underneath the carburetors. There's a couple of things that'll do that if you leave the drain plug loose when you drain the carb bowls, if you don't do the boots up tight enough when you put the carbs back on. I checked all that, everything was fine. When I had the carbs out, I dried everything off nice under there, made sure the top of the fuel pump was clean. So once everything was clean and dry and I pulled it over a few times, what I noticed is that there was fuel coming out of the little vent hole on the top of the fuel pump. So almost every time I see anybody mention that online, somebody will say there's a hole in the diaphragm. And that can happen, right? If you get a crack or a pinhole in that diaphragm, fuel will get through that should be pushed up to the carburetor and it can come out of the vent hole. But honestly, guys, more often than not, when you see fuel come out of the top of that pump, it's actually because your crankcase is loaded up with fuel. In the bottom of the carburetor, there's a valve called the needle and seat. And the job of the needle and seat is to shut off the flow of fuel whenever that bowl is full. So the problem with the needle and seat is they fail really easily. So they can get worn out over time and then fuel will leak around them. Or a little bit of grit that gets caught in there will also make them stick. And then your fuel is not going to shut off. It just continues to flow. So almost any time your crankcase is full of fuel like that, that's the cause. So I tested that by pulling the pulse line off the fuel pump with the fuel shut off and the ignition shut off and just pulling the engine over a bunch of times. So if you put that pulse line into something like a clear plastic water bottle and you keep pulling it over until that fuel stops, if you're getting like an appreciable amount of gas coming out of your crankcase, I can almost guarantee you the problem is the needle and seat. So the next thing I did was I took my carb apart and I cleaned it thoroughly, paying particular attention to the needle and seat. But the other thing I did, and really I wish I'd done it first, but I pressure tested the needle and seat. So I pressure tested it just using an inexpensive vacuum tester like this one. So there were a couple of things I noticed in the pump itself and in the carburetor. So when I cleaned my carbs, they were pretty dirty. There was a lot of grit in them, fairly noticeable grit, definitely something that could have held that needle and seat open. And in the pump itself, I don't know if you noticed when I showed you this before, but in the one-way valves on the inlet, there's also some crud that's pretty obvious. So if you look right there, I don't know if you can see that. See that right there? A little piece of black. It almost looks like a little piece of plastic. And then again, in the other valve of the inlet, there's a little black piece of plastic. I'm hoping the camera picks that up. So those little bits of plastic definitely are enough to hold that valve open because of where they were sitting. So that means this pump is not going to work as efficiently, right? So when the diaphragm is pushing, the fuel should be going up to the carbs. Some of it can leak back through those valves because they're not closing properly. Kind of like a heart murmur. The other thing I see is some dark black staining on the diaphragm and behind it. And that's from fuel being in that airspace where it shouldn't be. The other thing I did, I used this same tester to test the integrity of the diaphragm and gaskets in the fuel pump. All I did was I hooked the tester up to the pulse side of the fuel pump. I covered the vent hole in the top. And then very carefully, I applied a little bit of vacuum and just waited to see if it held, and it did. And then I flipped it over and I held that hole again and I applied a little bit of pressure and it held again. So I would caution not to put too much pressure into that because you could rupture the diaphragm, but I would think the pulse line would put at least a couple of pounds of pressure out anyway. So looking at this fuel pump, I think it definitely needs a good cleaning, and I'm going to throw a rebuild kit in it because I don't like the look of that diaphragm. So you can clean the metal components with carb cleaner or contact cleaner. Just be careful not to get that on the diaphragm or the gaskets. So it does say in the 97 service manual that you can test the inlet and outlet with a vacuum tester as well. So the inlet should be able to hold a little bit of vacuum and the outlet should be able to hold a little bit of pressure. Just remember though, if you have multiple outlets, you'll have to block one of them. Just cover it with your finger when you test it. So both of those tests failed. So that's another reason to go ahead and rebuild the pump. So now I got a couple of questions, and this is what I talked about when I said there are other things that will affect the fuel pump. So firstly, there was a more large debris inside the carbs than I would normally expect to see. Secondly, there shouldn't be debris inside the fuel pump, especially pieces of plastic, because inside the fuel tank, there should be a little screen or a filter on the end of the pickup line. So I'm suspecting that's what's failed, and I was right. So I just really carefully got a flashlight and I fished that pickup line up so I could have a look at it. The filter was on and it was intact and it looked relatively clean, but the pickup line itself was not attached to the grommet anymore. Actually, the pickup line's not attached to the grommet. There's like a 90-degree fitting there that goes through a rubber grommet into the tank. So it had fallen, it was laying loose on the bottom of the tank. So now just fuel unfiltered was going down into the fuel pump. But the other problem, and I'm going to tell you about this in another video, was the grommet itself was starting to deteriorate. And I think that's what those little black bits were that were getting into my fuel pump. Everything's back together and I've checked everything carefully for leaks. There's only one thing left to try. No fuel leaks anywhere that I can see. And there's no gas coming out of that vent hole. So after a few pulls to get the fuel through the system, the sled is starting and running the way that it should. I revved it up quite a bit. I let it warm up to temperature. I don't see any fuel coming out of that vent hole now. So I'm hoping that we fixed our problem. Now I just got to wait for snow. Okay, so that is basically it for the pulse or vacuum driven fuel pump. Hopefully that was interesting and that you learned something new. If it's all old hat to you, then feel free to leave a comment if there's anything that I missed. So I hope you liked that video, and if you did, let me know by hitting that thumbs up. All right, that's it guys. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll catch you next time. Going to unbolt the fuel pump. It's true, this is like a fairly high volume pump. What are the signs and symptoms that you might see if your fuel pump's farting?